You know, I've been telling stories for years about moments that change everything. Those split seconds when the world flips upside down and nothing's ever the same. But this one still gives me chills every time I think about it. It happened right here in our county courthouse, and I was there to see the whole damn thing unfold. Let me tell you about Elroy, Washington. If you've ever been to the Jefferson County Courthouse in downtown Cedar Falls, you've probably seen him. Hell, you might have even talked to him without knowing his story. He's the guy in the navy blue maintenance uniform, always carrying that worn leather toolbox, moving through the halls like he owns the place, which, in a way, he kind of does. Been working there for 8 years now, ever since he moved to town after his wife passed. Elroy's one of those men you notice without really noticing. You know what I mean? Tall, maybe 6'2", with shoulders that still fill out his uniform despite being north of 70. His hair's gone completely gray now, cut military short, and he's got these hands. Man, these hands tell a story. Scarred knuckles, calluses that speak of decades of hard work, and a wedding ring he still wears, even though Martha's been gone 3 years now. The thing about Elroy is he never complains. Not when the heating system breaks down in the middle of winter, not when some drunk decides to throw up all over the second-floor bathroom, not when the county commissioners cut his budget again. He just nods, says, "Yes, sir," or "I'll take care of it," and gets to work. Some folks might call that being a pushover, but I call it dignity. The man's got more dignity in his pinky finger than most people have in their whole body. Now, I need to set the stage for you because what happened next, it didn't happen in a vacuum. See, our little courthouse had been going through some changes. The county had hired this new security firm, Pinnacle Protection Services, and they'd brought in a bunch of young guys who looked like they'd stepped out of some military recruitment poster, all muscles and attitude, if you catch my drift. The head of this new crew was a guy named Brad Connor, 28 years old, buzzed blonde hair, the kind of square jaw that probably got him all the girls in high school. Brad had done 2 tours overseas, Iraq, I think, and came back with that swagger some young vets get when they think their service makes them bulletproof. Don't get me wrong, I respect anyone who's served, but there's a difference between being proud of your service and using it as an excuse to be an asshole. Brad had been on the job for maybe 3 weeks when this all went down. He'd already made it clear he thought the courthouse was being run too loose, too casual. He'd written up reports about security vulnerabilities and outdated protocols. The man was itching to flex his authority, and unfortunately for everyone involved, he set his sights on Elroy. It was a Tuesday morning in October, one of those crisp fall days when the leaves are just starting to turn and there's that smell in the air that makes you think of high school football games and your mom's apple pie. I was in early that day, had to testify in a case, and I was sitting in the lobby area reading the paper when I heard the commotion. Elroy was coming through the main entrance like he did every morning at 7:30 sharp. He had his toolbox in one hand and a cup of coffee from Murphy's Diner in the other. The man was a creature of habit, same routine every day for 8 years. But this morning was different because Brad Connor was stationed at the security checkpoint, and he was clearly in one of those moods. "Hold up there, Pops," Brad called out, his voice carrying that particular tone that immediately puts everyone on edge. "Bag check." Now Elroy had been walking through that checkpoint every workday for 8 years. Everyone knew him, the regular guards, the court clerks, hell, even Judge Morrison would wave to him from across the lobby. But Brad was new, and he was making a point. Elroy stopped, set down his coffee on the little table by the checkpoint, and opened his toolbox. "Good morning, officer," he said quietly. That's how Elroy talked, quiet, respectful, with just the slightest hint of what I always thought was a Virginia accent, though I never asked where he was from originally. Brad started pulling things out of the toolbox like he was conducting a federal investigation. Screwdrivers, wire nuts, electrical tape, a small voltage meter, all the basic tools a maintenance guy needs to keep an old building running. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just the tools of an honest man doing honest work. But Brad wasn't satisfied. "What's this?" he asked, holding up a small pocket knife, the kind every maintenance worker carries with maybe a 3-inch blade. "That's my utility knife," Elroy replied. For cutting electrical tape, opening packages, basic maintenance tasks. Weapons aren't allowed in the courthouse, Brad said, his voice getting louder. By now, he'd drawn the attention of everyone in the lobby, clerks heading to work, early attorneys, people there for morning arraignments. Elroy's brow furrowed slightly. Sir, I've carried that knife every day for 8 years. It's a tool, not a weapon. I use it for my work. I don't care what you've been doing, Brad snapped. I'm in charge of security now, and I say no weapons, period. The silence in the lobby was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ironically enough, people were pretending to read their papers or check their phones, but everyone was listening. You could feel the tension building like humidity before a thunderstorm. I understand your position, Elroy said, still calm as a mountain lake. Perhaps we could speak with... Perhaps nothing, Brad interrupted. You don't get to negotiate with me, old man. I'm the authority here. That's when it started to get ugly. Brad moved closer to Elroy, using his height and youth to intimidate. Let me guess, you've been coasting here for years, nobody checking up on you, doing whatever you want because you're the friendly old janitor, right? The word janitor came out of his mouth like a curse word. Elroy's job title was actually facilities maintenance technician, and he did everything from electrical work to plumbing to HVAC repair. The man could fix anything, and he'd probably saved the county thousands of dollars over the years with his expertise. But to Brad, he was just the janitor. I take pride in my work, Elroy said quietly. I keep this building running so everyone can do their jobs. Brad laughed, not a good laugh, but that nasty kind that's meant to humiliate. Yeah, I'm sure you take real pride in mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Must be quite the accomplishment for someone like you. The way he said, someone like you, man, it made my blood boil. He didn't say it outright, but everyone in that lobby knew exactly what he meant. And the thing that made it worse was that Elroy just stood there and took it, his face as calm as ever. But I could see something change in his eyes. Not anger, at least not yet, but something deeper. Disappointment, maybe. Like he'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. Brad wasn't done. Tell you what, Pops, from now on you use the service entrance. I don't want you tracking dirt through the main lobby every morning. This is a courthouse, not some factory break room. Several people in the lobby shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson from the clerk's office actually gasped a little. She'd known Elroy for years, watched him fix her computer when IT couldn't figure it out, seen him stay late to repair the heating in her office during that brutal cold snap 2 winters ago. The service entrance requires me to walk an extra quarter mile around the building, Elroy said. In the winter with ice. Not my problem, Brad cut him off. You don't like it? Take it up with your supervisor. Oh wait, I am your supervisor now. At least when it comes to security matters. That wasn't even true. Brad's company handled courthouse security, but the maintenance staff reported to the county facilities department. But Elroy didn't argue the point. He just nodded slowly, repacked his toolbox, and picked up his coffee. One more thing, Brad called out as Elroy started toward the service hallway. Next time you want to bring any tools into this building, you get them approved by me first. In writing. I don't care if it's a paperclip, you run it by me. Elroy stopped but didn't turn around. Understood, he said quietly, and continued down the hall. The lobby stayed quiet for a long moment after he left. People were looking at each other, looking at Brad, looking anywhere but directly at what had just happened. It was one of those moments where everyone knows something wrong just occurred, but nobody quite knows what to do about it. Brad, meanwhile, was strutting around the checkpoint like a rooster in a henhouse, clearly pleased with himself. He'd established dominance, shown everyone who was boss. At least, that's what he thought he'd done. What he'd actually done was humiliate a decent man in front of a dozen witnesses, and in a small town like Cedar Falls, word travels fast. By lunchtime, half the courthouse staff had heard about the incident. By the end of the day, it was the talk of Murphy's Diner and the Roadhouse Tavern. But here's the thing about small towns. We know our own. And Elroy Washington, despite being relatively new compared to some families that had been here for generations, was definitely one of our own. He'd earned that status not through bloodlines or politics, but through 8 years of quiet service, of being the guy you could count on, of treating everyone with respect regardless of their station in life. The next morning, I made it a point to get to the courthouse early. I wanted to see how this was going to play out. Elroy came through the service entrance as instructed, looking no different than usual. He nodded to folks, said his quiet good mornings, and went about his business. But I could tell he was stung by what had happened. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way he moved through the building like he was trying to make himself invisible. Brad, on the other hand, was riding high. He'd stationed himself at the main checkpoint again, checking IDs with unnecessary thoroughness, making people empty their pockets, generally being a pain in the ass. When Judge Morrison came through, a man who'd been on the bench for 20 years and commanded respect from everyone in the county, Brad made him take off his shoes. "Just following protocols, Your Honor," Brad said with that smug smile. Judge Morrison, to his credit, complied without complaint, but I could see the muscle in his jaw ticking. Nobody disrespects Judge Morrison in his own courthouse, and Brad was too dense to realize he was making enemies left and right. Around 10 a.m., Elroy got called to fix a problem with the air conditioning system in courtroom B. It was a complicated issue, something with the electronic controls that required both electrical knowledge and understanding of HVAC systems. I watched him work, and it was clear the man knew his stuff. He had that methodical approach of someone who'd been solving complex problems for decades. But when he finished the repair and was cleaning up his tools, Brad appeared in the doorway. "What's taking so long?" he demanded. "You've been in here for over an hour." Elroy looked up from where he was kneeling by the control panel. "The temperature sensor was malfunctioning, causing the system to cycle incorrectly. I had to trace the wiring, identify the faulty component, and replace it. The repair is complete." "I don't need a technical explanation," Brad said dismissively. "I need you to work faster. This courthouse has business to conduct, and we can't have you disrupting operations all morning." Several people in the hallway had stopped to listen. Among them was District Attorney Patricia Cole, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd prosecuted some high-profile cases and didn't suffer fools gladly. "Officer Connor," she interjected, "Mr. Washington wasn't disrupting anything. We couldn't use this courtroom until the air conditioning was fixed. He solved the problem." Brad's face reddened slightly. He didn't like being corrected, especially by a woman, and especially in front of an audience. "I'm just saying, maybe if he wasn't so old and slow, it wouldn't take so long." The hallway went dead quiet. Elroy slowly stood up, his toolbox in hand, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, at least not exactly, but something harder to define. Like he was looking at Brad and seeing something the rest of us couldn't see. "I apologize if my pace wasn't satisfactory," Elroy said in that same quiet voice. "I'll work on being more efficient." He walked past Brad without another word, but District Attorney Cole wasn't about to let it slide. "Officer Connor," she said, a voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I'd like to see you in my office. Now." I didn't hear what was said behind closed doors, but I can guess. Patricia Cole had been a prosecutor for over 20 years, and she'd dealt with her share of bullies. She also had the political clout to make Brad's life very difficult if she chose to. When Brad came out of her office 15 minutes later, his face was red and his jaw was set tight. He didn't look like a man who'd been having a pleasant conversation. But if I thought that little talking to was going to calm Brad down, I was wrong. Over the next few days, he seemed to double down on his campaign against Elroy. He'd find excuses to be wherever Elroy was working, questioning every repair, timing how long jobs took, generally making the man's life miserable. He started requiring Elroy to submit detailed written reports for every maintenance task, no matter how minor. Change a light bulb? Written report. Unclog a drain? Written report. Fix a squeaky door hinge? You better believe that required documentation. The worst part was how he did it. Always in front of people. Always with that tone that made it clear he thought Elroy was beneath him. And Elroy just took it. Every humiliation, every petty rule, every public dressing down. He'd nod, say, "Yes, sir," and continue with his work. It was driving people crazy. The courthouse staff, the attorneys, even some of the judges were getting fed up with Brad's behavior. But nobody quite knew what to do about it. The county had signed a contract with Pinnacle Protection Services, and Brad was their designated supervisor. Complaints would have to go through official channels, which meant paperwork and bureaucracy and weeks of back and forth. Meanwhile, Elroy was being treated like a second-class citizen in a building where he'd been a respected member of the team for 8 years. Things came to a head on a Friday afternoon in late October. The courthouse was busy. Friday afternoons always were, with people trying to wrap up cases before the weekend. Elroy was in the basement, working on the building's main electrical panel. We'd been having problems with power fluctuations, and he was trying to track down the source. Brad found him there, of course. I swear, that man had some kind of radar for finding opportunities to harass Elroy. "What the hell are you doing down here?" Brad demanded, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Elroy looked up from where he was studying a complex wiring diagram. "Troubleshooting the power fluctuation issue. Judge Morrison's computer crashed twice this morning, and the clerk's office lost power for 10 minutes during lunch." "Did you get authorization for this work?" "Emergency repairs don't require—" "I didn't ask for excuses," Brad snapped. "I asked if you got authorization. From me." Elroy set down his multimeter and turned to face Brad fully. For the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something different in his posture. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "Officer Connor," he said, his voice still calm but with an edge I'd never heard before. "I've been maintaining electrical systems since before you were born. This building's power grid is unstable, and if I don't fix it, people could lose important work, court proceedings could be disrupted, and in a worst-case scenario, we could have a fire." Brad stepped closer, using his size to intimidate. "I don't give a damn about your experience, old man. You work for the county, and as long as I'm in charge of security in this building, you follow my rules. And my rule is simple. You don't do anything without my say-so." "Even in an emergency?" "Especially in an emergency. For all I know, you're the one causing these problems in the first place. Maybe it's time this county hired someone who actually knows what they're doing instead of keeping some old." He caught himself before he finished that sentence, but we all knew where it was going. The silence stretched out between them, heavy with years of accumulated frustration and barely contained anger. "Some old what?" Elroy asked quietly. Brad's face flushed. "Nothing, just get back to work. And next time, you ask permission first." He turned to leave, but Elroy's voice stopped him. "Officer Connor." Brad turned back, annoyed. "What?" "That electrical panel you're leaning against. It's live with 240 volts. You might want to step away from it." Brad jerked away from the panel like he'd been stung, and for just a moment, he looked rattled. Then his expression hardened again. "Just fix the damn problem," he muttered, and stormed up the stairs. But something had shifted in that basement. I could feel it, and I think Elroy could too. The dynamic between them was changing, though none of us knew how dramatically. That weekend, something happened that would change everything. I didn't find out about it until Monday morning, when I was having coffee at Murphy's Diner and overheard Sally Morrison, Judge Morrison's wife, talking to her sister about their weekend plans. "We're supposed to drive down to the State Veterans Cemetery on Sunday," Sally was saying. "It's the 25th anniversary of that battle in Iraq. You know, the one where Brad Connor's father died. Brad's been planning this memorial service for months." My ears perked up at that. I knew Brad's last name was Connor, but I'd never made the connection to Sergeant Tommy Connor, who'd been killed in action in Iraq back in '99. Tommy had been a local boy, graduated from Cedar Falls High just a year ahead of my own son. The whole town had mourned when news of his death came back. "It's sweet that Brad wants to honor his father," Sally continued. "Though I have to say that boy's attitude around the courthouse leaves something to be desired." Her sister nodded. "Martha Washington used to clean for the Connors before Tommy shipped out. She always said what a good family they were. Such a tragedy." Martha Washington, Elroy's late wife. I sat there with my coffee getting cold, pieces of a puzzle starting to fall into place in my mind. But I couldn't quite see the whole picture yet. Not until Monday morning, when everything exploded. I got to the courthouse early that Monday, partly out of habit and partly because I was curious to see how the Brad Elroy situation was going to develop. What I found was Brad Connor standing in the lobby, looking like he'd seen a ghost. He was holding a newspaper, the Cedar Falls Gazette, and staring at something on the back page. His face was pale, and his hands were actually shaking a little. "You okay, son?" I asked, partly out of genuine concern and partly out of curiosity. He looked up at me with eyes that were confused and maybe a little scared. "Do you know anything about Elroy Washington?" Strange question. "I know he's a good man who does good work. Why?" Brad held up the newspaper. It was open to the Veterans Memorial page that the Gazette ran every Monday, featuring photos and stories from local veterans. And there, taking up half the page, was a photo I'd never seen before. It showed a much younger Elroy Washington in military dress uniform, standing at attention while an officer pinned something to his chest. The caption read, "Major Elroy Washington receives the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in action during Operation Desert Fox, Iraq, October 1999. But that wasn't the part that had Brad's attention. Below that was a longer article, and as I read over his shoulder, I started to understand why he looked like he'd been hit by a truck. The article detailed how Major Washington had led a daring rescue mission to extract a surrounded battalion that had been cut off by enemy forces. Under heavy fire and against direct orders to wait for backup, Washington had led 2 companies through enemy territory to reach the trapped soldiers. The mission had saved 127 lives, though it had cost Washington a piece of shrapnel in his leg that still troubled him to this day. And among the names of the soldiers rescued was Sergeant Tommy Connor, 82nd Airborne Division, Brad's father. I watched the color drain completely from Brad's face as he read the details. How Major Washington had personally carried the wounded Sergeant Connor to safety. How he'd stayed with the injured man during the helicopter evacuation, talking to him, keeping him conscious. How Tommy Connor had told his rescuer about his newborn son back home, a boy named Brad who he was determined to see grow up. According to the article, Sergeant Connor had survived that particular battle and lived for another 3 months before being killed in a separate engagement. But those 3 months, and the letters he'd been able to write home to his wife and infant son, had only been possible because of Major Elroy Washington's actions. Brad read the article twice, his lips moving silently as he worked through the words. Then he looked up and saw Elroy coming through the service entrance, toolbox in hand, following the route Brad had forced him to take. For a long moment, neither man moved. Elroy noticed Brad staring at him and probably saw the newspaper in his hands, but his expression didn't change. He just nodded his usual polite good morning and started toward the service elevator. "Mr. Washington," Brad called out, his voice cracking slightly. Elroy stopped and turned. "Yes, Officer Connor?" I need to talk to you." "Please?" There was something in Brad's voice that made everyone in the lobby look up. Gone was the arrogance, the swagger, the bullying tone. He sounded young suddenly and lost. Elroy studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." They walked over to a quiet corner of the lobby, and I shamelessly positioned myself where I could hear their conversation. So did half the courthouse staff, if I'm being honest. "Is this true?" Brad asked, holding up the newspaper with trembling hands. Elroy glanced at the article and nodded. "Yes. You saved my father's life." "I saved a lot of lives that day. That was my job." Brad's voice was barely a whisper. "He wrote about you. In his letters. He called you the Major and said you were the bravest man he'd ever met. He said you carried him out when you could have left him behind." "I don't leave men behind," Elroy said simply. "That's not who I am." "But I've been—" Brad's voice trailed off as the full weight of his behavior hit him. "Oh God, what have I done?" The silence in the lobby was complete. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Brad sank into one of the wooden benches, still holding the newspaper, looking like his entire world had just collapsed. "My father talked about you until the day he died," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said you were a hero. He said you gave him the chance to write those last letters to my mother to tell me he loved me. And I've been treating you like—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We all knew how he'd been treating Elroy. Elroy sat down on the bench beside him, setting his toolbox on the floor. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked his age, not frail, but tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "Your father was a good soldier," Elroy said quietly. "He talked about you constantly during that helicopter ride. Showed me pictures from his wallet. You were just a baby then, but he was so proud of you. So determined to make it home to watch you grow up." "He did make it home," Brad whispered. "For 3 months. Best 3 months of my childhood, even though I was too young to remember them clearly. But my mother told me stories about how he'd hold me for hours, reading to me from picture books, singing lullabies off-key." He looked up at Elroy with tears in his eyes. "That was because of you." Elroy nodded slowly. "He was thinking about you when I found him, half-conscious, bleeding, surrounded by enemy fire, and all he could talk about was getting home to his boy. That's the kind of courage that gets you through impossible situations." By now there wasn't a dry eye in the lobby. Mrs. Henderson was openly crying. Even Judge Morrison had appeared from his chambers and was watching from the balcony above, his usually stern face soft with emotion. Brad wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I owe you an apology. Hell, I owe you more than that. I owe you my entire life. If you hadn't saved my father, I never would have had those last months with him. I never would have had his letters to read when I was growing up. I never would have known how much he loved me." "You don't owe me anything," Elroy said. "Your father earned those months with his own courage. I just helped get him to safety. But I've been treating you terribly. I've been disrespecting you, humiliating you in front of people. I've been acting like a young man who didn't have his father around to teach him better," Elroy finished gently. "I understand that kind of anger, son. I've seen it before." Brad looked at him in surprise. "You're not angry with me?" Elroy was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I've been angry with a lot of things over the years. Angry at wars that take good men too soon. Angry at systems that don't work the way they should. Angry at myself for not being able to save everyone." He paused. "But I learned a long time ago that anger is like carrying hot coals in your pocket. You might think you're going to throw them at someone else, but you're the one who gets burned." "I'm so sorry," Brad said, his voice breaking. "I'm so fucking sorry." Nobody in the courthouse lobby corrected his language. The moment was too raw, too honest for worrying about profanity. "Apology accepted," Elroy said simply. But Brad wasn't done. He stood up suddenly, straightening his uniform, and did something that surprised everyone in the lobby. He came to attention and saluted. "Major Washington," he said in a clear, strong voice. "I should have recognized a superior officer when I saw one." Elroy looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he stood and returned the salute. "At ease, soldier. We're both civilians now." "No, sir," Brad said, still at attention. "Some things you never stop being." The lobby erupted in spontaneous applause. People were clapping, crying, hugging each other. It was like the entire courthouse had been holding its breath for weeks and everyone could finally exhale. But the real fireworks were just getting started. Within an hour, news of the confrontation had spread throughout the courthouse and beyond. By lunchtime, the story was all over social media. Someone had recorded part of the conversation on their phone, and the video was being shared faster than gossip at a church social. Local news picked up the story by evening, then regional news. By the next morning, it had gone national. Local veteran reveals hero's past to man who had been harassing him, read the headline in USA Today. The story detailed not just the confrontation and revelation, but the weeks of harassment that had preceded it. Pictures of both men appeared. Brad in his security uniform, Elroy in his maintenance clothes, and that powerful photo of a young Major Washington receiving his silver star. The reaction was swift and overwhelming. Pinnacle Protection Services found themselves dealing with a public relations nightmare. Their employee had been caught on video harassing an elderly veteran, a decorated war hero who had literally saved lives. The optics were terrible. The phone in the county commissioner's office rang off the hook, with people demanding justice for Elroy and consequences for Brad. Online reviews for Pinnacle Protection plummeted overnight. #JusticeForElroy started trending on Twitter. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because what happened next wasn't what anyone expected. It was Elroy who saved Brad's job. 3 days after the confrontation, Pinnacle Protection was ready to fire Brad and potentially lose their contract with the county. The company's CEO, a slick-talking executive from the state capitol, showed up at the courthouse with a termination letter and a plan to replace Brad immediately. That's when Elroy knocked on the commissioner's office door and asked to speak with everyone involved. "I understand there's been some discussion about Officer Khanna's employment," he said in that same quiet, dignified voice we all knew so well. The Pinnacle CEO, a guy named Richards, who looked like he'd stepped out of a men's fashion magazine, nodded gravely. "Mr. Washington, I want to assure you that we take this situation very seriously. Officer Khanna's behavior was completely unacceptable, and we're prepared to terminate his employment immediately." "I appreciate that," Elroy replied, "but I'd like to make a different suggestion." Everyone in the room leaned forward. What could Elroy possibly suggest? "Officer Khanna made mistakes," Elroy continued. "Serious mistakes that hurt me personally and created a hostile work environment. But I've had 3 days to think about this situation, and I keep coming back to something his father once told me." He paused, looking directly at Richards. "Sergeant Connor said that the best way to honor fallen soldiers isn't to be perfect yourself, but to help other people become better than they were. Officer Connor has shown remorse for his actions and a genuine desire to change. I think his father would want him to have that chance." The room was dead silent. Richards looked like someone had just thrown him a curveball he wasn't prepared to hit. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting we use this as a learning opportunity," Elroy said. "Not just for Officer Connor, but for your entire organization. Develop a sensitivity training program. Bring in speakers to talk about respect, dignity, and the diversity of backgrounds people bring to any workplace. Make this a teachable moment instead of just a termination." Brad, who had been sitting silently in the corner looking like he wanted to disappear, spoke up. "Mr. Washington, I don't deserve—" "It's not about what you deserve," Elroy interrupted gently. "It's about what you can become. Your father didn't survive that firefight just so you could throw your life away over pride and prejudice. He survived so you could grow up to be a better man than you are today." Commissioner Janet Walsh, who had been listening intently, nodded slowly. "What would this training program look like?" Elroy had clearly thought this through. Monthly workshops for all security personnel. Guest speakers including veterans from different backgrounds, community leaders, and people who've experienced discrimination firsthand. And Officer Connor would be required to attend every session for the next 2 years, plus complete additional community service hours with veteran organizations. "And you'd be willing to participate in this program?" Richards asked. still looking stunned. "I'd be honored to help develop it," Elroy replied. That's how the Jefferson County Courthouse became the first facility in the state to implement comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training for security personnel. Within 6 months, 3 other counties had adopted similar programs. Within a year, Pinnacle Protection had rolled out the training statewide. But the changes went deeper than just formal programs. Brad Connor became a different man almost overnight. The swagger was gone, replaced by humility. The arrogance was replaced by curiosity. He started asking questions instead of making assumptions. He listened instead of lecturing. More importantly, he and Elroy began to develop an unlikely friendship. Brad would arrive early to work just to have coffee with Elroy before the courthouse opened. They'd talk about everything: military service, growing up without a father, the challenges of being a black man in a predominantly white town, the weight of carrying family legacy. Elroy became a mentor to Brad in ways that went far beyond work. He taught him about patience, about earning respect instead of demanding it, about the difference between authority and leadership. And Brad, for his part, brought energy and enthusiasm to projects around the courthouse, working alongside Elroy to implement improvements that made everyone's job easier. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Within months, Brad had gone from being the most disliked person in the courthouse to someone people actually sought out for help. He started a support group for young veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. He organized volunteer days where courthouse staff would help with community projects. He even convinced Pinnacle Protection to sponsor a scholarship for children of fallen soldiers. But perhaps the most powerful moment came 6 months after that confrontation in the lobby. It was Memorial Day, and the town was holding its annual ceremony at Veterans Park. Elroy had been asked to speak about his service, though he'd initially declined. He wasn't comfortable being in the spotlight, preferring to honor fallen soldiers quietly and privately. Brad had been the one to convince him to change his mind. "Major," he said during one of their morning coffee conversations, "people need to hear your story, not because you're a hero, though you are, but because they need to understand what service really means. They need to understand that heroes don't always look like what they expect." So there was Elroy, standing at the podium in Veterans Park, looking out at a crowd of several hundred people. He spoke for maybe 10 minutes about duty, sacrifice, and the bonds between soldiers. He talked about Tommy Connor and the other men who didn't make it home. He talked about the responsibility the living have to honor the dead by building a better world. But the moment that brought everyone to tears came at the end, when Brad Connor walked up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice strong and clear, "I'd like you to meet the man who gave me the greatest gift possible, the chance to know my father's love. Major Elroy Washington didn't just save Sergeant Tommy Connor's life in Iraq, he saved mine too, though it took me 25 years to realize it." The applause was thunderous. People were on their feet, wiping away tears, reaching out to shake Elroy's hand. But the most powerful image was Brad and Elroy standing together at that podium. 2 men from different generations, different backgrounds, who had found their way to mutual respect and genuine friendship. That's the story I tell people when they ask me about justice. Real justice isn't always about punishment, though sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes it's about redemption. Sometimes it's about giving people the chance to become better than they were. Elroy Washington could have destroyed Brad Connor's career with a single interview. He could have sued Pinnacle Protection for creating a hostile work environment. He could have made Brad's life miserable in a dozen different ways, and most people would have said he deserved it. Instead, he chose grace. He chose to see potential where others saw only problems. He chose to honor his fallen friend by helping that friend's son become the man his father would have wanted him to be. That's the kind of strength that doesn't make headlines very often, but it's the kind that changes the world, one person at a time. Elroy still works at the courthouse, though his title has been upgraded to Senior Facilities Manager. and his salary has been significantly increased. Brad still works security, but he also serves as the coordinator for Pinnacle Protection's diversity training program. They still have coffee together most mornings, two veterans sharing stories and supporting each other through the challenges of civilian life. And in the lobby of the Jefferson County Courthouse, there's now a small plaque that reads, "In honor of all who serve, in uniform and out, and in recognition that true strength comes not from the power to tear down, but from the courage to build up." It doesn't mention any names, but everyone who works there knows exactly who it's for. You know, I started this story by saying it was about a moment that changed everything. But the more I think about it, the more I realize it wasn't really about a single moment at all. It was about a series of choices, some bad, some good, but all leading to the possibility of redemption. Brad Connor chose to be a bully, but he also chose to listen when truth was revealed. Elroy Washington chose patience when he could have chosen anger, grace when he could have chosen revenge. The courthouse staff chose to support justice when they could have chosen silence. The community chose healing when they could have chosen division. These days we hear a lot about how divided we are, how different, how impossible it is to bridge the gaps between us. But I've seen those bridges built with nothing more than honesty, humility, and the willingness to see each other as human beings worthy of respect. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not in the streets, but in the quiet corners of everyday life, where ordinary people make extraordinary choices to treat each other with dignity. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're a decorated war hero or a young man trying to figure out who you want to be. We all have the power to tear down or build up, to divide or unite, to perpetuate old hurts or create new possibilities. The choice, as always, is ours.